What if the most dangerous part of your road trip isn't the drive, but what's waiting along the way? Tonight we're covering 11 terrifying true stories that will make you think twice before hitting the road alone. From highways that don't exist on maps to serial killers posing as hitchhikers, these aren't legends. They're real experiences from people who barely survived. We'll start with reality-bending encounters and end with stories so disturbing they've left permanent scars. Some remain unsolved mysteries that baffle investigators, while others reveal the darkness lurking in unexpected places. Hit subscribe and the notification bell before we start. You don't want to miss our real horror stories. Drop a comment about your own creepy road trip experiences, because after these 11 stories, you might realize that weird encounter wasn't so innocent. Let's begin with our first story that will change how you think about getting lost. Let's move to our first story. Eleanor had driven the route from Denver to Phoenix countless times over the past 5 years. As a pharmaceutical sales rep, Interstate 25 South to Interstate 40 West was as familiar to her as her own driveway. She knew every truck stop, every scenic overlook, and every speed trap along the way. Which is exactly why what happened on that October evening in 2019 still haunts her sleep and makes her question everything she thought she knew about reality. The day had started normally enough. Eleanor left Denver at 3 p.m., planning to reach Flagstaff by midnight for an early morning client meeting. The weather was crisp but clear, perfect driving conditions for the long haul ahead. She'd made this journey so many times that she could practically drive it with her eyes closed, which made what happened next all the more terrifying. Everything proceeded normally through Colorado Springs and Pueblo. Eleanor stopped for gas in Trinidad, just as she always did, grabbing her usual coffee and energy bar from the convenience store. The attendant was the same elderly man who'd been working there for years, and they exchanged their typical pleasantries about the weather and road conditions. By 7 p.m., she was crossing into New Mexico, right on schedule. That's when things began to feel off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what was wrong. The familiar landmarks along Interstate 25 seemed somehow different. The mountains looked wrong somehow, not quite the right shape or color in the fading daylight. She told herself it was just the unusual lighting conditions, maybe some atmospheric phenomenon that was playing tricks with her perception. After all, she'd driven this route in every kind of weather and lighting condition imaginable. But then she started noticing the signs. Highway markers that didn't quite match what she remembered. Exit signs for towns she'd never heard of, despite driving this route for years. At first, she assumed they were just new developments, or perhaps communities she'd somehow overlooked in all her previous trips. But as she continued driving, the signs became increasingly bizarre. Next exit, Millbrook, 5 miles, read one sign. Eleanor had never heard of Millbrook, and it certainly wasn't on her usual route. She checked her GPS, but the screen showed her still traveling south on Interstate 25, exactly where she should be. Yet the landscape around her looked increasingly unfamiliar. The terrain seemed flatter than it should be, lacking the distinctive mesas and rock formations that characterize this stretch of New Mexico highway. Then came the sign that made her stomach drop. Welcome to Colorado. Elevation 5,280 feet. Eleanor slammed on her brakes, pulling over to the shoulder with her heart pounding. This was impossible. She'd been driving south for hours. She'd crossed into New Mexico and seen the welcome sign. How could she possibly be entering Colorado again? And at 5,280 feet elevation, which was Denver's elevation, not the elevation of any border crossing she knew about. Eleanor grabbed her phone to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. Not just weak signal, no signal whatsoever, as if she'd driven into some kind of dead zone, Her GPS still showed her location as somewhere on Interstate 25 in New Mexico. But the landscape outside her windshield looked nothing like New Mexico. In fact, it looked like nothing she'd ever seen before. Rolling hills covered in vegetation that seemed too green for the desert Southwest, under a sky that had turned an unsettling shade of purple, despite it being only 8 p.m. She decided to take the next exit, whatever it was, and try to get her bearings. Maybe she could find a gas station or restaurant where she could ask for directions and figure out what was happening. The exit ramp led to a 2-lane road that curved away into the distance, marked only by a generic services sign with no indication of what those services might be. As Eleanor drove down the exit ramp, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In her rearview mirror, the interstate she'd just left was no longer visible. Not hidden by trees or hills, but simply gone, as if it had never existed. She stopped the car and got out, walking back toward where the on-ramp should have been. There was nothing but empty road stretching in both directions, with no sign of the interstate she'd just exited. Panic began to set in. Eleanor got back in her car and drove forward, hoping to find some explanation, some landmark that would help her understand where she was. The 2-lane road seemed to go on forever, perfectly straight with no curves or hills. Along the way, she passed signs for places that sounded real but wrong. Riverside, population 2,847, for a town that was nowhere near any river. Mountain View, established 1892, in an area completely devoid of mountains. The strangest part was the consistency of it all. This wasn't like a dream where things constantly shifted and changed. Everything remained perfectly stable and realistic, just wrong. The road was well maintained. The signs looked official and weathered, as if they'd been there for years. The landscape, while unfamiliar, followed all the normal rules of geography and physics. It was reality, just not the reality she knew. After what felt like hours of driving, Eleanor began to notice that she was passing the same landmarks repeatedly. A distinctive red barn, a cluster of 3 billboards advertising businesses she'd never heard of. A water tower painted with a design she couldn't quite make out in the darkness. At first, she thought they were just similar structures. But as she passed the red barn for the 4th time, she had to accept the impossible truth. She was driving in some kind of loop. The fuel gauge became her greatest source of anxiety. She'd filled up in Trinidad, but now the needle was approaching empty. In normal circumstances, she would have found a gas station hours ago. But there were no gas stations here, no services of any kind, despite the signs promising them. Just the endless road, the repeating landmarks, and the growing certainty that she was trapped in something that shouldn't exist. Eleanor tried everything she could think of. She attempted to turn around and drive back the way she'd come, but the road behind her looked identical to the road ahead. She tried taking what appeared to be side roads, but they all led back to the main road within a few hundred yards. She even tried driving off-road, but her car would inexplicably steer itself back onto the pavement, no matter how hard she fought the wheel. The most disturbing part was the time. Her dashboard clock showed that hours were passing, but her phone, when it occasionally picked up a signal, showed a different time entirely. Sometimes her phone would display a time from earlier in the day, sometimes from the next day. The timestamps on the few text messages that managed to come through were equally nonsensical, as if time itself had become unstable in this place. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. Eleanor rounded a curve that she'd taken dozens of times before and found herself staring at a familiar sight. The bright lights of a truck stop she recognized. The GPS coordinates on her phone showed her exact location on Interstate 40 in Arizona, roughly 200 miles west of where she'd taken that impossible exit. According to her phone, it was 2:30 a.m., meaning she'd been driving for over 6 hours since her last clear memory. But here's what still terrifies Eleanor. According to her odometer, she'd driven only 127 miles since filling up in Trinidad. Yet she was now 400 miles further along her route than she should have been. The math was impossible. She'd somehow covered twice the distance she'd actually driven, with several hours of her life spent in a place that couldn't exist on any map. Eleanor never reported the incident to authorities. Who would believe such a story? Instead, she spent the years since trying to research similar experiences, finding scattered accounts online from other drivers who describe eerily similar encounters with impossible roads and lost time. She's learned that these stories are more common than most people realize, hidden away in the corners of the internet where people share experiences they know sound insane. To this day, Eleanor still makes the drive from Denver to Phoenix for work. But now she never travels alone, and she's memorized every landmark, every exit, every mile marker along the way. Because somewhere out there, she knows, is a road that leads to nowhere and everywhere at once, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to take that wrong turn into the impossible. Let's move to our second story. Steve Fishman had always considered himself a good judge of character. At 28, he'd traveled extensively across the American West, picking up hitchhikers when the mood struck him and his instincts told him it was safe. He prided himself on being able to read people quickly, distinguishing between genuine travelers in need and those who might pose a threat. It was a skill he'd developed over years of cross-country drives, and it had never failed him. Until that sweltering July afternoon in 1975, when his intuition would prove to be catastrophically wrong in ways he wouldn't discover for months. The day started like any other summer road trip. Steve was driving his beat-up Volkswagen van from Los Angeles to Denver, taking the scenic route through Arizona and Colorado. He'd quit his job at a manufacturing plant the week before, using his savings to fund what he called his Freedom Tour across America. The van was loaded with camping gear, a cooler full of beer, and enough optimism to fuel 1,000 miles of adventure. Somewhere between Flagstaff and the Colorado border, as the afternoon sun beat mercilessly through his windshield, Steve spotted a figure standing beside the road with his thumb extended. The man appeared to be in his 30s, average height and build, wearing faded jeans and a red flannel shirt despite the oppressive heat. His reddish-brown hair caught the sunlight, giving him an almost boyish appearance that seemed harmless enough. Steve slowed the van and pulled over, already feeling good about his decision to help a fellow traveler. The man jogged up to the passenger door with a grateful smile that immediately put Steve at ease. "Thank God," the hitchhiker said as he climbed into the van. "I've been standing out there for 3 hours. Name's Red, by the way." Red settled into the passenger seat with practiced ease, suggesting he was an experienced hitchhiker. He was polite, soft-spoken, and genuinely appreciative of the ride. As they pulled back onto the highway, Red explained that his car had broken down about 50 miles back, and he was trying to get to Colorado Springs to stay with a friend while he figured out his next move. The story was plausible, delivered without any of the nervousness or over-explanation that Steve had learned to associate with people who weren't being truthful. What struck Steve most about Red was how normal he seemed. Not just normal, but actually pleasant company. Red had an easy way of making conversation without being intrusive or overly personal. He asked thoughtful questions about Steve's travels, shared interesting observations about the landscape they were passing through, and even had a good sense of humor. When Steve mentioned he was a bit hungry, Red offered to share some snacks he'd bought at the last truck stop, pulling out packages of crackers and beef jerky from a well-worn backpack. As the miles rolled by, Steve found himself genuinely enjoying Red's company. The hitchhikers seemed well-read and had apparently traveled extensively throughout the western United States. He told engaging stories about various places he'd been, from the forests of Oregon to the deserts of Nevada. Red had a particular talent for describing the small, quirky details that made each location memorable. The way morning fog rolled through certain mountain passes, the sound coyotes made in different regions, the friendliness or suspicion of locals in various small towns. Red also demonstrated an impressive knowledge of practical travel skills. He knew which truck stops had the cleanest restrooms, which stretches of highway were most likely to have speed traps, and which camping areas offered the best combination of scenery and safety. When Steve's van started making a strange rattling noise, Red correctly diagnosed it as a loose heat shield and showed him how to temporarily fix it using some wire from his backpack. The conversation flowed so naturally that Steve almost forgot he was giving a ride to a complete stranger. Red asked about Steve's background, his plans for the future, and his reasons for taking this particular trip. In return, Red shared what seemed like genuine insights about his own life, his struggles to find steady work, his love of being on the road, and his philosophy about the freedom that came from not being tied down to any particular place or routine. As evening approached, Steve faced a decision. His original plan had been to drive straight through to Denver, but Red's destination of Colorado Springs was about an hour south of that route. Without hesitation, Steve offered to take Red all the way to Colorado Springs, even though it meant adding extra miles and time to his own journey. Red was grateful, but insisted he didn't want to impose. The ensuing conversation revealed more of Red's character. He seemed genuinely considerate about inconveniencing others and offered to contribute gas money, which Steve politely declined. They reached Colorado Springs just as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Red directed Steve to a modest residential neighborhood where he said his friend lived. As they pulled up to a small house with a well-maintained front yard, Red gathered his belongings and thanked Steve profusely for the ride. He even insisted on writing down Steve's address so he could send a thank you card, a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and genuine. Before getting out of the van, Red made an observation that would stick with Steve for years to come. "You know," Red said, looking directly at Steve with those calm, intelligent eyes, "you're a good person for picking up strangers. Most people are too suspicious these days, too afraid of everyone they don't know. But you can tell a lot about someone's character by how they treat people who can't do anything for them in return." Steve watched Red walk up to the front door and knock. A woman answered, apparently recognizing Red, and Steve felt satisfied that he'd successfully helped someone reach their destination safely. As he drove away, Steve reflected on what a pleasant surprise the encounter had been. In a world where people often warned against picking up hitchhikers, Red had been proof that there were still decent people out there who sometimes just needed a helping hand. The encounter faded into the background of Steve's memory as he continued his travels and eventually returned to a more conventional lifestyle. He got married, started a family, and settled into a career that required less wandering and more stability. Occasionally, when the topic of travel or hitchhiking came up in conversation, Steve would mention his positive experience with Red as an example of how most people are fundamentally good if you give them a chance. That comfortable belief lasted until March of 1976, nearly 8 months after their encounter. Steve was reading the morning newspaper when a headline caught his attention. "Confessed serial killer linked to multiple highway murders." The story detailed the arrest of Robert Frederick Carr III, a 31-year-old drifter who had confessed to killing at least 15 people across multiple states between 1974 and 1975. As Steve read the article, a cold realization began to settle in his stomach. The physical description matched: average height and build, reddish-brown hair, early 30s. But it was the nickname that made Steve's blood run cold. Law enforcement and the media had taken to calling the suspect Red Carr because of his distinctive hair color. Steve's hands shook as he continued reading. The article detailed Carr's modus operandi. He would hitchhike between states, targeting other hitchhikers, campers, and travelers who stopped to help him. He was particularly known for his ability to appear completely normal and trustworthy, often spending hours or even days with potential victims before revealing his true nature. Several survivors described him as articulate, knowledgeable about travel, and possessing an almost magnetic personality that made people want to help him. The timeline matched perfectly. According to the article, Carr had been active throughout the summer of 1975, traveling extensively through Arizona, Colorado, and surrounding states. Several of his confirmed victims had been found along highways in the exact areas where Steve had picked up Red. The dates of some attacks fell within days of Steve's encounter with the hitchhiker. But perhaps most chilling of all was a detail buried deep in the article. One investigator noted that Carr seemed to take particular pleasure in psychological manipulation, sometimes spending extended periods with people who could have become victims, apparently enjoying the power of knowing he could kill them at any moment, while they remained completely unaware of the danger they were in. Steve realized with growing horror that he had spent nearly 6 hours alone in a confined space with one of America's most prolific serial killers. Red, Robert Frederick Carr III, had sat inches away from him, making pleasant conversation and sharing snacks while presumably deciding whether or not to add Steve to his list of victims. Every laugh they had shared, every thoughtful observation Red had made, every moment of apparent human connection had been occurring, while a calculating predator evaluated Steve as potential prey. The knowledge that Red had specifically commented on Steve's trusting nature took on a sinister new meaning. Had it been a warning, a private joke, or simply the musings of someone who understood exactly how his victims' compassion and willingness to help strangers had made them vulnerable to him? Steve never learned why Red had chosen not to kill him that day. Perhaps Steve's change of route to Colorado Springs had disrupted whatever plan Red might have had. Perhaps Red had decided that Steve's van was too distinctive and memorable for a clean getaway. Or perhaps, most disturbingly, Red had simply been in a good mood and decided to spare Steve's life on a whim. The revelation fundamentally changed how Steve viewed human nature and his own judgment. He had prided himself on being able to read people, yet he had spent hours in the company of a serial killer without sensing any danger whatsoever. Red had been everything Steve thought a trustworthy person should be: polite, considerate, intelligent, and grateful. The realization that such apparent normalcy could mask such profound evil left Steve questioning every assumption he'd ever made about his ability to assess people. For years afterward, Steve would wake up in cold sweats, remembering moments from that drive with new understanding. Red's knowledge of remote camping areas and truck stop routines now seemed like the professional expertise of a predator. His philosophical comments about trust and human nature felt like the musings of someone who had extensively studied and exploited those very qualities in his victims. Steve never picked up another hitchhiker again. Let's move to our third story. Mark Tromp had built what most people would consider the perfect life. At 51, he owned a successful berry farm in Sylvan, Victoria, spanning over 400 acres of prime agricultural land about an hour east of Melbourne. The Tromp family berry operation had been thriving for years, supplying major supermarket chains across Australia with high-quality strawberries and blueberries. Mark worked the land alongside his wife Jacoba, 53, and their 3 adult children, Mitchell, 25, Ella, 22, and Rihanna, 29. To their neighbors and business associates, the Tromps appeared to be a close-knit, hard-working family, living the Australian dream. But beneath the surface of this idyllic existence, something had begun to go terribly wrong in the months leading up to August 2016. Mark had started expressing concerns to family members about being watched and monitored. Initially, these worries seemed relatively minor. Complaints about feeling like their phones were being tapped or that strangers were asking too many questions about their business operations. Jacoba and the children attributed these concerns to stress from running a large agricultural operation during a particularly challenging growing season. However, Mark's paranoia began to escalate dramatically throughout July and early August. He became convinced that their property was under surveillance by unknown entities, possibly government agencies or criminal organizations. He started checking and rechecking locks, insisting that family members avoid using their cell phones, and expressing beliefs that their internet activity was being monitored. What alarmed the family most was how these concerns seemed to be spreading to other family members, particularly Jacoba, who began echoing Mark's fears about being watched and followed. The situation reached a critical point on August 29, 2016, when Mark made an announcement that would shatter his family's world forever. He declared that they needed to leave their property immediately, abandoning everything they had worked for decades to build. Mark was convinced that staying at the farm posed an imminent threat to their safety, though he could never articulate exactly what that threat was or who might be behind it. Most disturbing of all, he insisted that they could not take any electronic devices with them. No cell phones, no GPS units, no credit cards that could be traced. What happened next defied all logic and understanding. Despite having no concrete evidence of any actual threat, the entire Tromp family agreed to abandon their successful business and comfortable life to embark on what Mark described as a necessary escape. On the morning of August 30th, 2016, all 5 family members climbed into their silver Peugeot sedan, leaving behind their home, their farm, their employees, and any means of electronic communication or navigation. The family's initial destination appeared to be northern New South Wales, though Mark's planning seemed haphazard and paranoid. He had withdrawn a significant amount of cash before their departure, apparently believing that using credit cards would allow whoever was supposedly tracking them to locate their position. Jacoba had packed only essential items, and the adult children brought minimal belongings, as if they genuinely believed they might never return home. The journey began ominously. Mark, who was driving, seemed increasingly agitated as they traveled north from Victoria into New South Wales. He frequently checked his mirrors, convinced they were being followed, and took unexpected detours that added hours to their travel time. The family members later described the atmosphere in the car as tense and frightening, with Mark's paranoia seeming to intensify with each passing mile. By the time they reached Bathurst, New South Wales, approximately 200 kilometers west of Sydney, the psychological pressure had reached a breaking point. Jacoba, who had been supporting her husband's fears throughout the journey, suddenly experienced what can only be described as a complete mental breakdown. Without warning, she exited the vehicle and began running through the streets of Bathurst in a state of obvious distress and confusion. Local residents found Jacoba wandering aimlessly, unable to explain who she was or why she was there. She appeared disoriented and terrified, speaking incoherently about threats and dangers that only she could perceive. Concerned citizens contacted local police, who quickly determined that Jacoba was experiencing some form of psychological crisis. She was taken to Bathurst Hospital for evaluation and treatment, becoming the first family member to be separated from the group. Meanwhile, Mark and the 3 adult children continued their journey without Jacoba, though her departure seemed to accelerate the psychological deterioration of the remaining family members. Mitchell, the youngest son, later described feeling trapped between his desire to help his obviously distressed father and his growing realization that their situation was spiraling completely out of control. The next family member to separate from the group was Mitchell himself. Somewhere between Bathurst and their next destination, Mitchell made the difficult decision to abandon the family's increasingly irrational journey. Unlike his mother's dramatic breakdown, Mitchell's departure was more calculated. He managed to contact friends who could help him, and he eventually made his way back toward Melbourne, though he would later require professional counseling to process the trauma of witnessing his family's psychological disintegration. This left Mark with his 2 daughters, Ella and Rihanna, continuing what had become an increasingly desperate and directionless flight from imaginary pursuers. Mark's driving became more erratic as his paranoia reached new heights. He was convinced that every vehicle behind them was part of an elaborate surveillance operation, and he began taking increasingly remote routes through rural areas of New South Wales in an attempt to avoid detection. The psychological contagion that had infected the family reached its most disturbing manifestation in Rihanna, Mark's eldest daughter. As they continued their journey, Rihanna began exhibiting signs of severe dissociation and reality distortion that surpassed even her father's paranoid delusions. She started expressing beliefs that she was no longer herself, that her identity had somehow been compromised or stolen by the same forces her father believed were pursuing them. The situation became critical when they reached the town of Yass, approximately 280 kilometers southwest of Sydney. Rihanna's psychological state had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer distinguish between her internal fears and external reality. In a moment that would haunt the family forever, Rihanna suddenly exited the vehicle and began running toward a nearby train station, apparently believing that boarding a train would somehow help her escape from whatever psychological prison she found herself trapped within. Tragically, Rihanna was struck and killed by a truck as she ran toward the railway station. Her death represented the ultimate consequence of the mass psychological breakdown that had consumed the Tromp family, transforming a successful farming family's inexplicable paranoia into a devastating tragedy that would leave permanent scars on all the survivors. Mark and Ella, now reduced to just the 2 of them, were found by police later that day in a state of severe psychological distress. Both were taken into custody for their own safety and immediately provided with psychiatric evaluation and care. Mark appeared to have completely lost touch with reality, unable to explain why they had left their farm or what they had been running from. Ella was somewhat more coherent, but clearly traumatized by witnessing her family's disintegration and her sister's death. The investigation that followed revealed no evidence whatsoever of any actual threats to the Tromp family. Police thoroughly examined their property, their business records, their personal communications, and their financial situation. No surveillance equipment was found on their property. No threatening communications were discovered. No criminal organizations or government agencies had any interest in the family. Their business was financially stable and legally compliant. There was simply no rational explanation for the fears that had driven them to abandon everything and embark on their tragic journey. Mental health professionals who evaluated the surviving family members diagnosed what appeared to be a case of shared psychotic disorder, also known as folie à deux. though in this case affecting multiple family members simultaneously. This rare condition occurs when delusions and paranoid beliefs spread from one person to others in close contact with them, particularly within families or other tightly connected groups. The stress of running a demanding agricultural business, combined with Mark's underlying psychological vulnerabilities, appeared to have triggered an initial paranoid episode that then infected other family members through their close emotional bonds and daily interactions. The Tromp family tragedy became a case study in how mental illness can spread through family systems and how shared delusions can lead to catastrophic real-world consequences. Mitchell, who had separated from the family early in their journey, required months of therapy to process his guilt over not being able to prevent the tragedy. Ella needed even more extensive treatment to recover from the trauma of witnessing her family's breakdown and her sister's death. Mark spent considerable time in psychiatric care before gradually recovering enough to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. Jacoba, who had been the first to be hospitalized, eventually recovered her mental stability, but was left to grapple with the devastating loss of her daughter and the destruction of her family. The berry farm, once a source of pride and prosperity, was eventually sold, as the family could never return to the place where their shared delusions had first taken root. The Tromp family case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how psychological contagion can transform a normal family into fugitives from imaginary threats, ultimately leading to real and irreversible tragedy. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that the human mind's capacity for self-deception can be more dangerous than any external threat, and that sometimes the most terrifying enemies are the ones that exist only in our own heads. Let's move to our fourth story. Jennifer Walsh had always been a careful driver, the kind of person who planned her routes in advance, kept her gas tank full, and never traveled unfamiliar roads after dark if she could help it. At 34, she worked as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, which meant she spent considerable time driving between hospitals and clinics across the rural stretches of Northern California. Her job required her to be practical, observant, and professional, qualities that had served her well in both her career and her personal life. On this particular Tuesday evening in September 2018, Jennifer was returning from what should have been a routine client visit in the small town of Willits, about 3 hours north of San Francisco. She had planned to complete the drive back to her home in Petaluma during daylight hours. But her final appointment had run longer than expected when the hospital administrator insisted on a detailed walkthrough of their new cardiac wing. By the time she finished her presentation and loaded her sample cases back into her Honda Accord, the sun was already setting behind the coastal mountains. Jennifer faced a choice that many solo travelers, particularly women, have to make. Take the faster but more isolated route through the backwoods, or stick to the main highways despite the significantly longer drive time. Highway 101 would add nearly an hour to her journey, but it offered the safety of consistent traffic, well-lit truck stops, and cell phone coverage. The back roads through the Anderson Valley would cut her travel time substantially, but they wound through miles of uninhabited forest, where a breakdown could leave her stranded until morning. Fatigue made the decision for her. Jennifer had started her day with a 6 a.m. client meeting in Eureka, followed by appointments in 3 different towns. She'd been on the road for over 10 hours, surviving on convenience store coffee and energy bars. The thought of adding another hour to her drive felt overwhelming, especially since she had an early morning meeting scheduled in San Rafael the next day. Against her better judgment, Jennifer decided to take the shortcut through the mountains. The route began innocuously enough. State Route 253 west from Ukiah was a well-maintained 2-lane highway that connected several small communities in the Anderson Valley. Jennifer had driven this road before during daylight hours and remembered it as scenic but unremarkable. Winding through redwood forests and past the occasional vineyard or rural homestead. With her headlights cutting through the growing darkness, she settled into the rhythm of mountain driving, taking the curves at a cautious speed while staying alert for deer or other wildlife that might wander into the roadway. For the first 45 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Jennifer passed through the tiny communities of Boonville and Philo, their few streetlights providing brief reassurance before she returned to the isolated darkness of the forest road. Her phone showed 2 bars of signal strength, enough for emergency use if needed. The fuel gauge indicated she had plenty of gas to reach Petaluma, and her car was running smoothly despite the demanding mountain terrain. It was just after 9 p.m. when Jennifer noticed headlights approaching from behind. In itself, this wasn't unusual. Other travelers used this route, and she'd already passed several vehicles heading in the opposite direction. What caught her attention was how quickly the vehicle was gaining on her. Jennifer was driving at a reasonable speed for the conditions, perhaps 5 miles per hour below the posted limit, to account for the darkness and unfamiliar curves. The approaching vehicle seemed to be traveling much faster, its headlights growing larger in her rearview mirror with alarming speed. Jennifer's first instinct was to slow down and move as far right as possible to allow the other driver to pass safely. She assumed it was probably a local resident who knew the road well and was comfortable driving faster than a cautious, out-of-town visitor. As she reduced her speed and hugged the right edge of the roadway, she expected to see the other vehicle swing into the left lane and overtake her at the next safe opportunity. Instead, the vehicle slowed to match her reduced speed, maintaining its position directly behind her. Jennifer could see in her mirrors that it appeared to be a pickup truck or SUV, riding high enough that its headlights were nearly at the level of her rear window. The lights were bright, possibly modified with aftermarket bulbs that seemed designed to blind following drivers. What disturbed Jennifer most was the deliberate nature of the vehicle's behavior. It was clearly capable of passing her, but the driver seemed to be choosing to stay behind her instead. Jennifer tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps the other driver was also unfamiliar with the road and was using her car as a guide through the difficult terrain. Maybe they were being cautious about passing on the winding mountain highway and were waiting for a longer straight stretch. She told herself that she was probably overreacting, letting her fatigue and the isolated setting fuel unnecessary anxiety about what was likely an innocent coincidence. But as the miles passed, Jennifer's unease continued to grow. The vehicle behind her maintained an uncomfortably close following distance, never more than a few car lengths away, despite the challenging driving conditions. When Jennifer slowed for particularly sharp curves, the other driver slowed as well. When she accelerated on straight stretches, the vehicle behind her matched her speed perfectly. Most unnervingly, the truck made no attempt to pass, even when they encountered long, straight sections of highway with clear visibility and no oncoming traffic. Jennifer tried several subtle tests to gauge the other driver's intentions. She deliberately reduced her speed to well below the limit, hoping the other driver would become impatient and pass her. Instead, the truck slowed to match her pace. She pulled partially onto the shoulder at one point, as if checking something with her car, but the truck simply stopped behind her and waited. When she resumed driving, it resumed following at the same uncomfortably close distance. By now, Jennifer's hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, and she could feel her heart rate increasing. Every instinct was telling her that this was not normal driving behavior. The driver behind her was deliberately shadowing her movements, and she couldn't think of any innocent explanation for such persistent tailgating on an isolated mountain road late at night. The situation escalated dramatically when Jennifer crested a small hill and found herself on a particularly long, straight stretch of highway. In the distance, she could see what appeared to be road construction signs and orange cones set up across both lanes of traffic. As she approached, however, something about the scene struck her as wrong. The construction zone appeared to be unmanned, with no workers or equipment visible. More importantly, there were no official vehicles or proper warning signs leading up to the work area. Jennifer slowed her approach and turned on her hazard lights, trying to assess the situation more carefully. What she saw made her blood run cold. Stretched across the roadway was what appeared to be a spike strip, a device typically used by law enforcement to puncture the tires of fleeing vehicles. The strip was positioned to force any vehicle to drive over it, as the orange cones blocked any possibility of driving around it. But this wasn't a police checkpoint. There were no squad cars, no uniformed officers, no official barriers or signage. Just the spike strip and cones, positioned to look like legitimate road construction in the darkness. As Jennifer's headlights illuminated the scene more clearly, she realized with growing horror that this was a trap, set up to disable vehicles and leave their occupants stranded in this isolated location. Jennifer's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. The vehicle that had been following her was now directly behind her, its high-beam headlights flooding her car with blinding light. She couldn't see who was in the truck, but she could hear its engine revving as if preparing to block any attempt she might make to reverse or turn around. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had been herding her toward this trap, using her own car's headlights to guide her into the ambush. In that moment of terrifying clarity, Jennifer realized she had perhaps seconds to react before she became a victim of whatever these people had planned. The spike strip was only about 50 yards ahead, close enough that she couldn't stop safely on the wet mountain road, even if she slammed on her brakes immediately. Behind her, the truck was accelerating, apparently intending to ram her forward over the spikes if she tried to stop. Jennifer made a split-second decision that probably saved her life. Instead of braking or trying to turn around, she floored the accelerator and aimed her car directly at the gap between two orange cones on the right side of the road. Her Honda crashed through the makeshift barrier, bottoming out as it left the pavement and tore through the underbrush beside the highway. Jennifer fought to maintain control as her car bounced and scraped over rocks and fallen branches, its undercarriage taking a beating but the tires remaining intact. In her rearview mirror, Jennifer could see the truck that had been following her skid to a stop beside the spike strip. Two figures emerged from the vehicle, one of them appearing to shout angrily in her direction. But she was already too far away to make out details. Jennifer kept her foot on the accelerator, crashing through small trees and bushes until she found what appeared to be an old logging road that led back toward the main highway. It took Jennifer nearly 20 minutes of careful off-road driving to work her way back to pavement, emerging onto Highway 101 several miles south of where she'd left Route 253. Her car was damaged, but functional, its paint scratched and bumpers dented from the wild ride through the forest. More importantly, she was alive and free. Having escaped what she now understood had been a carefully planned ambush by people with unknown but certainly malicious intentions. Jennifer drove directly to the nearest police station, where she reported the incident to officers who took her account seriously, but admitted they had limited ability to investigate without more specific location information or descriptions of the suspects. The remote location, darkness, and Jennifer's understandable focus on escape had prevented her from gathering details that might have led to arrests. In the days that followed, Jennifer learned that she wasn't the first person to report suspicious activity on that stretch of highway. Other drivers had described being followed or encountering unusual roadblocks, though none had come as close as Jennifer to actually being trapped by the spike strip, police theorized that she had encountered a robbery crew that used the isolated road to target lone travelers, disabling their vehicles and robbing them in a location where victims would be unlikely to receive help quickly. Jennifer never learned what would have happened to her if she hadn't escaped, and she preferred not to think about it too deeply. The experience fundamentally changed how she approached travel, particularly alone and at night. She invested in better emergency communication equipment, modified her work schedule to avoid late-night driving, and never again took shortcuts through remote areas without informing someone of her exact route and expected arrival time. Most importantly, Jennifer learned to trust her instincts completely. The subtle signs that had alerted her to danger, the unusual following behavior, the suspicious timing, the improperly marked construction zone, had provided just enough warning to save her life. She often wondered how many other travelers had encountered similar traps on lonely roads, and how many had been less fortunate in their ability to recognize and escape the danger in time. Let's move to our fifth story. Hazel had driven through 3 states in 12 hours, pushing herself beyond her normal limits in an effort to reach her sister's wedding in Phoenix before the rehearsal dinner. What should have been a straightforward 8-hour drive from her home in Denver had been complicated by unexpected construction delays, a minor fender bender that required a 2-hour wait for police reports, and her own stubborn refusal to stop for proper rest breaks. By 5 a.m., exhaustion was making her eyelids heavy, and she knew she had no choice but to pull over for at least a short break before continuing the final stretch to Arizona. The rest stop she chose appeared unremarkable in the pre-dawn darkness. A standard state facility with the usual concrete building housing restrooms and vending machines, surrounded by a few picnic tables and a small parking area. At this early hour, the place was completely deserted, which Hazel actually preferred. She'd always felt slightly uncomfortable at crowded rest stops, particularly as a woman traveling alone, and the solitude meant she could stretch her legs and use the facilities without having to interact with strangers or worry about her safety. Hazel pulled her silver Camry into a parking space near the restroom building and sat for a moment, letting the engine idle while she gathered her things. The silence was profound. No traffic noise from the interstate, no sounds of other travelers, just the quiet hum of her car's engine and the distant chirping of early morning birds. She checked her phone and saw that she had about 2 hours of driving left before reaching Phoenix, which meant she could afford a 10-minute break to splash water on her face and grab a coffee from the vending machine. As she stepped out of her car, Hazel felt the cool desert air against her skin, a welcome relief after hours in the stuffy interior of her vehicle. She locked the car out of habit, though it seemed unnecessary in such an isolated location, and walked toward the restroom building. The motion sensor lights flickered on as she approached, illuminating the concrete structure and casting harsh shadows that made the empty parking area look even more desolate. The women's restroom was exactly what she expected. Institutional tile floors, fluorescent lighting, and the antiseptic smell of industrial cleaning products mixed with the underlying mustiness that seemed to permeate all public facilities. Hazel was relieved to find it relatively clean and well-maintained, though the harsh lighting made her look pale and exhausted in the mirror above the sinks. She splashed cold water on her face, ran wet fingers through her hair, and took a moment to stretch her back, which ached from the long hours of driving. It was as she was preparing to leave the restroom that Hazel first noticed something was wrong. Through the small ventilation window near the ceiling, she caught a glimpse of movement in the parking area outside. Someone was crouched beside her car, though from her angle inside the restroom, she couldn't see exactly what they were doing. Her initial thought was that perhaps another traveler had arrived and was having car trouble. But something about the furtive way the figure was moving made her hesitate. Hazel pressed herself against the wall beneath the window and tried to get a better view without exposing herself. What she saw made her stomach drop with fear. A man in dark clothing was lying on his back, apparently sliding himself underneath her car. This wasn't someone seeking help or dealing with their own vehicle problems. This was someone deliberately hiding beneath her car, positioning himself where she wouldn't be able to see him when she returned. The implications hit Hazel immediately. When she walked back to her car, the man would be directly beneath it, probably intending to grab her ankles or legs when she approached the driver's door. Even if his intentions weren't immediately violent, being pulled to the ground in this isolated location would leave her completely vulnerable to whatever he had planned. The calculated nature of his positioning suggested this wasn't a random encounter. He had specifically chosen her car and was lying in wait like a predator. Hazel's hands began to shake as she realized the full scope of her predicament. She was alone at a deserted rest stop in the middle of nowhere, with no other travelers around to help her. Her car keys were in her pocket, but reaching her vehicle would require walking directly over the spot where the man was hiding. Even if she ran toward her car, he would have the advantage of surprise and could easily grab her before she could unlock the door and get inside. Her first instinct was to call for help, but when she pulled out her phone, she discovered she had no cell signal. The remote location that had seemed peaceful just minutes earlier was now a trap, cutting her off from any possibility of summoning assistance. She was completely on her own, with a predator waiting just outside and no way to escape without confronting him directly. Hazel forced herself to think rationally, despite the panic flooding her system. She couldn't stay in the restroom forever. Eventually, the man would realize she wasn't coming out and might decide to come looking for her. The building had only one entrance, which meant he could easily trap her inside if he chose to. Her only advantage was that he probably didn't know she had spotted him, which might give her a brief element of surprise if she could figure out how to use it. After several minutes of agonizing indecision, Hazel heard the sound that turned her fear into absolute terror. The heavy outer door of the restroom building creaked open, followed by footsteps echoing off the tile walls. Someone had entered the building, and given the circumstances, she had no reason to believe it was anyone other than the man who had been hiding under her car. "Hello?" a male voice called out, the tone artificially friendly in a way that made Hazel's skin crawl. "Is anyone in here? I saw a car outside and wanted to make sure everything was okay." Hazel remained perfectly silent, pressing herself against the wall in the corner of the restroom that was furthest from the entrance. The voice had an oily quality that suggested its owner was enjoying this game of cat and mouse. He knew she was in here. Her car was parked directly outside, and there was nowhere else she could have gone. But he was pretending to be a concerned Good Samaritan rather than acknowledging his predatory behavior. The footsteps moved closer, and Hazel could hear the man systematically checking each stall in the restroom. The sound of stall doors being pushed open echoed through the tiled space, each one bringing him closer to her hiding spot. She realized with growing horror that there were only 6 stalls in the women's restroom, and he was methodically working his way down the line toward where she was trapped. "I know you're in here," the voice said, dropping the pretense of friendliness. "I saw you go in, and I didn't see you come out. There's no point in hiding. I'm not going anywhere until we have a chance to talk." Hazel watched in terror as a pair of men's boots appeared under the door of the stall next to where she was hiding. The man was now close enough that she could hear his breathing, and she realized he was probably looking under each stall door to locate her exact position. In a few seconds, he would reach her stall, and her hiding place would be discovered. Desperation gave Hazel a sudden burst of clarity. She realized that her only chance was to act before he could pin down her location. If she waited for him to find her, she would be trapped in the confined space of the bathroom stall with no room to maneuver or defend herself. But if she could catch him off guard while he was still searching, she might be able to push past him and reach the exit. Hazel took a deep breath, gathered all her courage, and burst out of her hiding spot with a loud scream designed to startle and disorient her stalker. The man, who had been bent over looking under stall doors, jerked upright in surprise as she rushed toward the exit. For a crucial moment, he was off balance and unable to react quickly enough to stop her. But Hazel's escape attempt was only partially successful. As she reached the restroom entrance, she felt the man's hand grab the back of her jacket, spinning her around and slamming her against the concrete wall beside the door. She found herself face to face with her attacker for the first time. A middle-aged man with unkempt hair and wild eyes that suggested either drug use or severe mental illness. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled, his grip tightening on her jacket. "We haven't finished our conversation yet." Hazel knew this was likely her last chance to escape. Once he got her away, from the building entrance, her chances of survival would drop dramatically. Summoning every ounce of strength and adrenaline in her body, she drove her knee upward as hard as she could, connecting with the man's groin and causing him to double over in pain. His grip on her jacket loosened, and she wrenched free, bolting toward the exit. Behind her, she could hear the man cursing and beginning to give chase, but the injury had slowed him down enough to give her a crucial head start. Hazel burst through the outer door and ran toward her car, fumbling for her keys as she approached. To her relief, she could see that the man was no longer underneath the vehicle. Apparently, he had abandoned that position when he decided to come into the restroom after her. Hazel reached her car and managed to unlock it just as the man emerged from the restroom building, still moving gingerly, but clearly intent on continuing his pursuit. She threw herself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine in one fluid motion, backing out of the parking space before her attacker could reach the vehicle. As she sped away from the rest stop, Hazel could see the man in her rearview mirror, standing in the parking area and watching her escape. The sight of him growing smaller in the distance was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen, representing her freedom from what could easily have been a fatal encounter. Hazel drove directly to the next town, where she found a police station and reported the incident. The officers took her statement seriously and promised to investigate the rest stop. Though they warned her that without a license plate number or better description of the suspect, prosecution would be difficult. They also noted that similar incidents had been reported at remote rest stops throughout the region, suggesting that her attacker might be part of a pattern of predatory behavior targeting solo travelers. The experience fundamentally changed how Hazel approached travel safety. She never again stopped at isolated rest areas, particularly during early morning or late evening hours when few other travelers were around. She invested in better emergency communication equipment and always informed family members of her exact travel route and expected arrival times. Most importantly, she learned to trust her instincts completely. The moment she spotted the man hiding under her car, every alarm bell in her mind had been ringing, and listening to those warnings had probably saved her life. Hazel eventually made it to her sister's wedding, arriving several hours late but grateful to be alive. She never told her family the full story of why she was delayed, not wanting to cast a shadow over the celebration. But she carried the memory of that terrifying encounter as a permanent reminder that predators often strike when their victims are most vulnerable. Tired, alone, and far from help. Her escape had been as much about quick thinking and determination as it had been about luck. And she knew that not every woman in a similar situation would be fortunate enough to get away. Let's move to our sixth story. James had been driving trucks for over 20 years, covering millions of miles across America's highways and seeing just about everything the road could throw at a professional driver. At 53, he'd navigated through blizzards that turned interstates into parking lots, survived encounters with aggressive motorists who seemed determined to play chicken with 18-wheelers, and witnessed accidents that would haunt his dreams for months afterward. He considered himself a practical man, someone who dealt in concrete realities like fuel efficiency, delivery schedules, and DOT regulations rather than superstitions or ghost stories. Which is why what happened on Highway 87 in Arizona during the early morning hours of March 15, 2017, challenged everything James thought he knew about the rational, predictable world he'd spent decades navigating. It began as a routine haul from Phoenix to Flagstaff, carrying a load of construction equipment that needed to be delivered before the work crews arrived at 8 a.m. James had driven this route countless times, and Highway 87 through the Sonoran Desert was as familiar to him as his own driveway. The highway stretched ahead in a perfectly straight line for miles, cutting through landscape that seemed almost alien in its stark beauty. Towering saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels against the star-filled sky, their arms raised in permanent surrender to the desert's harsh embrace. At 3:30 a.m., James was the only vehicle visible in either direction, which wasn't unusual for this stretch of road at this hour. The isolation was actually preferable. No four-wheelers weaving unpredictably between lanes, no construction zones to slow his progress. Just the steady rhythm of his diesel engine, and the hypnotic yellow lines disappearing beneath his headlights. James had installed a dash cam system 6 months earlier, partly for insurance purposes and partly because his company required all drivers to have video documentation of their routes. The camera captured everything through his windshield in high-definition detail, automatically saving footage whenever the truck's sensors detected unusual vibrations or sudden braking. It was a practical investment that James rarely thought about, simply part of the modern trucking industry's emphasis on documentation and liability protection. The first sign that something unusual was happening came at mile marker 247, about 30 miles south of Flagstaff. James noticed what appeared to be a person walking along the shoulder of the highway, moving in the same direction as his truck, but at the leisurely pace of someone out for an evening stroll rather than someone dealing with a roadside emergency. In itself, this wasn't entirely unprecedented. James had encountered stranded motorists, hitchhikers, and even the occasional drunk college student who'd wandered away from a party. But something about this figure struck him as odd, from the moment he spotted it in his headlights. The person appeared to be small in stature, possibly a woman or child, wearing what looked like a light-colored dress or gown that seemed to flow in the desert breeze. What was strange was how the figure was walking directly on the white line that marked the highway's shoulder, maintaining perfect balance despite the narrow space, and the fact that James's massive truck was approaching from behind with its headlights illuminating the entire scene. James slowed his rig and moved into the left lane to give the pedestrian plenty of clearance, which was standard protocol when encountering anyone on foot near the roadway. As he drew closer, however, he began to notice details that made his rational mind struggle to process what he was seeing. The figure appeared to be translucent, as if he could see through the person to the desert landscape beyond. The clothing seemed to be from another era entirely, not the casual wear of a stranded motorist, but something more formal and old-fashioned. Most disturbing of all was the figure's behavior. Despite the approach of a massive truck with blazing headlights and the rumbling diesel engine that could be heard for miles in the desert silence, the person showed no awareness of the vehicle whatsoever. No turning to look, no stepping further from the roadway, no acknowledgement that tons of steel and machinery were passing just feet away at 65 miles per hour. James watched in his mirrors as the figure continued walking after he passed, maintaining the same steady pace and mysterious indifference to its surroundings. He grabbed his CB radio to alert other drivers who might be traveling this route, but the radio crackled with static that made communication impossible. Even his cell phone showed no signal, which was unusual, but not unheard of in some of the more remote stretches of Arizona highway. The encounter bothered James more than he wanted to admit. In 20 years of trucking, he'd seen plenty of things that defied easy explanation. Unexplained lights in the sky, animals behaving strangely, weather phenomena that seemed to appear from nowhere. But he'd always been able to rationalize these experiences or dismiss them as products of fatigue, eye strain, or the mind's tendency to create patterns where none existed. This felt different. The figure he'd passed had been too clear, too detailed, and too impossible to explain away. James tried to focus on his driving and put the incident out of his mind. But his thoughts kept returning to the strange pedestrian. The translucent quality of the figure bothered him most of all. He'd convinced himself that it must have been a trick of the lighting, perhaps caused by the angle of his headlights, hitting road dust or desert heat shimmer. But deep down, he knew what he had seen, and it challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. It was at mile marker 251, just 4 miles further down the highway, that James encountered the figure again. This time, there was no mistaking what he was seeing. The same translucent person in period clothing was walking along the shoulder in exactly the same manner as before. The impossibility of the situation hit James immediately. Even if the figure had been a real person, there was no way they could have covered 4 miles in the few minutes since his truck had passed them. James pulled his rig over to the shoulder and stopped, leaving his hazard lights flashing while he tried to make sense of what was happening. He stepped out of his cab and looked back down the highway. But the figure was no longer visible. The desert was empty in all directions, with no place for a person to hide, even if they had wanted to. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of his truck's cooling engine and the distant sound of wind moving through the saguaro cacti. Getting back into his cab, James checked his dashcam system to see if it had recorded the encounter. What he found on the footage would haunt him for the rest of his life. The camera had captured everything in crystal clear detail. The translucent figure walking along the shoulder, the old-fashioned clothing, even the way the person seemed to glide rather than walk in a normal manner. But most disturbing of all was a detail James hadn't noticed while driving. The figure cast no shadow on the pavement, despite being illuminated by his truck's powerful headlights. The timestamp on the footage confirmed James's memory of the encounter, ruling out any possibility that fatigue or highway hypnosis had caused him to imagine or distort what he'd seen. The dashcam was a neutral electronic witness that had recorded something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged the basic laws of physics and human experience. James continued his drive to Flagstaff, but the remainder of the journey passed in a haze of confusion and unease. He delivered his load on schedule and completed the necessary paperwork, but his mind kept returning to the footage stored on his dashcam. Over the following days, he showed the video to other truckers, mechanics, and even his dispatcher, hoping someone could provide a rational explanation for what the camera had captured. The reactions were consistent and unsettling. Everyone who viewed the footage agreed that it showed something extraordinary and unexplainable. Some suggested technical glitches or optical illusions, but the clarity and consistency of the recording made such explanations seem inadequate. Others mentioned similar encounters they'd heard about from drivers who worked the Arizona routes, stories that had been dismissed as highway legends or the products of sleep-deprived minds. Curious about the location where he'd encountered the figure, James began researching the history of Highway 87 and the surrounding desert area. What he discovered added another layer of mystery to his experience. the stretch of highway where he'd seen the translucent figure pass through an area that had been the site of numerous fatal accidents over the years, many involving pedestrians who had wandered onto the roadway for reasons that were never fully explained. Local newspaper archives revealed accounts dating back decades of drivers reporting similar encounters. Translucent figures walking along the highway, always in the same general area, always displaying the same indifference to passing traffic. Most of these reports had been dismissed by authorities as products of fatigue, optical illusions, or attention-seeking behavior. But the consistency of the descriptions, combined with James's high-definition video evidence, suggested something more substantial was occurring. The most chilling discovery came when James found historical records indicating that the current Highway 87 had been built over an older desert trail that had been used by travelers for generations. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, several people had died along this route, including a young woman whose body was found beside the trail in 1897. According to contemporary newspaper accounts, she had been wearing a light-colored dress and appeared to have been walking alone across the desert when she succumbed to exposure and dehydration. James never encountered the figure again during subsequent trips along Highway 87, though he found himself watching for it every time he drove that route. The dashcam footage became something of a legend among truckers who worked the Southwest, passed around at truck stops, and shared on social media platforms dedicated to paranormal encounters. Some viewers remained skeptical, proposing elaborate technical explanations for what the camera had captured. Others saw it as proof that the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinner than most people believed. The experience fundamentally changed James's perspective on the nature of reality and the possibility that consciousness might survive physical death. He'd always been a practical man who dealt in observable facts and measurable phenomena. But the encounter on Highway 87 forced him to acknowledge that there might be aspects of existence that couldn't be explained by conventional understanding. Years later, James still drives trucks across America's highways, but he's more aware now of the mysteries that might lurk just beyond the reach of his headlights. He's learned that the road holds secrets that go deeper than traffic patterns and fuel consumption, and that sometimes the most compelling evidence for the impossible comes not from ghost stories or urban legends, but from the clear, unblinking eye of a dashboard camera recording something that shouldn't exist. The footage remains as clear and disturbing as the day it was recorded, a digital testament to an encounter that challenges everything we think we know about the nature of life, death, and the thin places where the two worlds might occasionally intersect on a lonely desert highway in the early morning darkness. Let's move to our seventh story. Paul Henricks had been driving long-haul routes for Midwest Express Freight for over 15 years, and in that time, he'd seen enough roadkill to fill a small cemetery. Deer, raccoons, possums, cats, dogs. The American highway system was a graveyard for wildlife that couldn't adapt to the reality of high-speed traffic cutting through their natural habitats. As a professional driver who spent 3 weeks out of every month on the road, Paul had developed a practiced eye for identifying different types of animal remains, mostly as a matter of practical necessity for avoiding tire damage and maintaining safe following distances. It was this experience that made what he discovered on Interstate 90 near the Montana-North Dakota border so deeply disturbing. Paul had been driving eastbound through the pre-dawn darkness of November 12, 2019, hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Spokane to Minneapolis. The weather was clear but cold, with temperatures hovering just above freezing and a light frost making the highway surfaces slippery enough to require extra caution. At approximately 4:45 a.m., Paul's headlights illuminated what appeared to be a large piece of roadkill about 200 yards ahead in the right lane. Based on the size and general shape, His initial assessment was that it was probably a deer that had been struck by an earlier vehicle and left in the roadway. This wasn't an unusual sight on this stretch of interstate, which passed through areas with large deer populations that regularly crossed the highway during their seasonal migrations. Paul began the standard protocol for encountering roadkill, checking his mirrors for following traffic, signaling a lane change to the left, and reducing speed slightly to ensure he could safely navigate around the obstruction. However, as he drew closer and his headlights provided better illumination of the scene, details began to emerge that made him increasingly uncomfortable with what he was seeing. The shape was wrong for a deer or any other large animal Paul was familiar with. It appeared to be roughly cylindrical, lacking the distinctive limbs and head that would be expected from wildlife. The coloration was also unusual. Instead of the brown, gray, or tan fur typical of regional wildlife, this object appeared to be pale, almost flesh-colored in the glare of his headlights. Most disturbing of all was the size, which seemed too large for most animals, but too small for something like an elk or moose. Paul's years of experience had taught him to be cautious around roadkill for several practical reasons. Fresh carcasses could still pose hazards if they contained hard parts like antlers or hooves that might damage tires. Older remains sometimes attracted scavengers that could dart into traffic unexpectedly. But something about this particular scene triggered instincts that went beyond professional caution into genuine unease. As Paul moved into the left, lane and began to pass the obstruction. His headlights provided a clear view that would be burned into his memory forever. What lay in the roadway was not an animal at all, but what appeared to be a human torso. Headless, limbless, and precisely dismembered in a way that suggested deliberate butchery rather than the random trauma of a vehicle collision. The torso was positioned lengthwise in the lane, as if it had been carefully placed there rather than accidentally deposited. The severing points where the head and limbs had been removed showed clean, straight edges that looked surgical in their precision. There was remarkably little blood visible on the pavement around the remains, which suggested either that the dismemberment had occurred elsewhere and the torso transported to this location, or that significant time had passed since the initial injury. Paul's immediate instinct was to stop and investigate, both out of human decency and civic responsibility. If this was evidence of a crime, which seemed overwhelmingly likely, then documenting the scene and reporting it to authorities could be crucial for solving what was obviously a serious, violent crime. However, Paul also recognized the potentially dangerous situation he was facing as a lone driver on an isolated stretch of highway in the early morning hours. If someone was actively disposing of human remains in this area, they might still be nearby. Stopping could put Paul at risk of encountering whoever was responsible for this gruesome scene. Additionally, as a commercial truck driver, Paul was well aware of the legal complexities that could arise from becoming involved in a criminal investigation, particularly one involving a homicide. His company had strict policies about unauthorized stops and delays that could affect delivery schedules. Paul made the difficult decision to continue driving while he considered his options. He noted the exact mile marker location, 352.7 on eastbound Interstate 90, and the time of his observation. He also activated his dash camera system to record a GPS timestamp that would corroborate his account if needed later. However, the camera's angle and the darkness meant that it likely hadn't captured clear footage of the remains themselves. For the next 20 miles, Paul wrestled with the moral and practical implications of what he'd witnessed. The rational part of his mind insisted that he needed to report this discovery to law enforcement immediately. A human being had been killed and dismembered, and the perpetrator was apparently using public highways to dispose of the evidence. Every minute that passed without police involvement was time that could allow the killer to escape or destroy additional evidence. However, Paul also understood the realities of his situation as a long-haul trucker. Becoming a witness in a major criminal investigation would likely mean significant delays, missed delivery deadlines, and potential complications with his employer. The trucking industry operated on extremely tight schedules, and drivers who caused delays, even for legitimate reasons like cooperating with police investigations, often faced disciplinary action or termination. Paul's internal debate was resolved when he reached the next truck stop, about 30 miles east of where he'd made his grisly discovery. Despite the potential professional consequences, he knew he couldn't live with himself if he failed to report what might be crucial evidence in a murder case. He parked his rig and used the payphone at the truck stop to contact the Montana State Highway Patrol, providing them with the exact location and time of his observation. The dispatcher who took Paul's call initially seemed skeptical of his report, apparently assuming it was either a prank call or a case of mistaken identification of animal remains. However, when Paul provided specific details about the clean dismemberment cuts and the deliberate positioning of the torso, the dispatcher's tone became more serious. She informed Paul that a patrol unit would be dispatched to investigate the scene and asked him to remain available for follow-up questions. Paul provided his contact information and route details, then continued with his delivery run while waiting for further contact from law enforcement. He spent the remainder of his drive in a state of heightened alertness, constantly scanning the roadway for anything else that seemed out of place. The image of that precisely severed torso remained vivid in his mind, raising disturbing questions about who could have committed such a calculated act of violence. The follow-up call from investigators came 6 hours later, while Paul was unloading his cargo in Minneapolis. The state trooper who contacted him confirmed that they had located and secured the remains exactly where Paul had reported finding them. Preliminary examination at the scene supported Paul's assessment that the torso showed signs of deliberate dismemberment rather than accidental trauma. However, the investigator also provided information that made the situation even more disturbing. By the time the patrol unit had reached the location, scavengers had already discovered the remains. A pack of wolves had apparently been in the process of feeding on the torso when the officers arrived, and they had to use sirens and spotlights to drive the animals away from the scene. The presence of scavengers complicated the investigation significantly. Crucial evidence might have been destroyed or scattered by the feeding animals. More importantly, if Paul had stopped to investigate when he first discovered the remains, he might have found himself in direct competition with a pack of hungry wolves for access to what they perceived as a meal. The thought of being trapped between potential human killers and wild animals in the pre-dawn darkness of a remote highway made Paul grateful for his decision to continue driving. The investigation that followed would reveal even more disturbing details. The torso was eventually identified as belonging to a 34-year-old drifter who had disappeared from a small town about 200 miles away. The precision of the dismemberment suggested someone with anatomical knowledge, possibly medical or veterinary training. The remote location where the remains were dumped indicated familiarity with the area and highway traffic patterns. Most chilling of all was the investigators' revelation that this wasn't an isolated incident. Over the past 2 years, several similar discoveries had been made along remote stretches of interstate highways in Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota. In each case, precisely dismembered human remains had been found in locations that suggested careful planning and knowledge of police patrol schedules and traffic patterns. Paul learned that he had potentially witnessed evidence from an active serial killer who was using the interstate highway system to dispose of victims. The killer appeared to be targeting transient individuals whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or investigated. The precise dismemberment and careful disposal methods suggested someone who was organized, methodical, and likely to continue killing until apprehended. The investigation remained active for months, with Paul providing additional testimony and cooperating with FBI profilers who were working to understand the killer's methods and psychology. However, despite extensive investigation and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, no arrests were made in connection with the case. Paul's discovery on Interstate 90 became part of a larger pattern of evidence that investigators hoped would eventually lead to the killer's identification and capture. However, the remote locations, careful disposal methods, and apparent randomness of victim selection made the case extremely challenging to solve. The killer seemed to understand how to exploit the vastness and isolation of America's highway system to commit crimes and dispose of evidence with minimal risk of detection. The experience fundamentally changed Paul's perspective on long-haul trucking and highway travel in general. He became much more aware of the potential for criminal activity in remote areas and more cautious about stopping in isolated locations. He also developed a deeper appreciation for the role that truck drivers and other highway travelers play as informal guardians of the interstate system, often serving as the only witnesses to crimes committed in areas too remote for regular police patrol. Years later, Paul still drives the same routes through Montana and the Dakotas, but he remains vigilant for signs of criminal activity or anything else that seems out of place. He knows that somewhere out there, a methodical killer might still be using America's highways as a hunting ground and disposal site. The thought that he might someday encounter fresh evidence of these crimes keeps him alert and reminds him that the lonely stretches of interstate highway can hide secrets far more disturbing than simple roadkill. The case remains unsolved, filed among the growing number of highway-related crimes that challenge law enforcement's ability to investigate effectively across vast geographic areas. For Paul, the memory of that precisely dismembered torso serves as a permanent reminder that evil can appear in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most horrifying discoveries are the ones that look almost normal until you get close enough to see the terrible truth. Let's move to our 8th story. Detective Frank Turner had investigated hundreds of homicides during his 23 years with the Kansas City Police Department. But nothing had prepared him for the systematic terror that would unfold across America's heartland during the spring of 1992. What began as an isolated incident in Indianapolis would evolve into one of the most chilling unsolved serial killing sprees in American history, stretching across 5 states and leaving investigators with a profile of a killer so brazen and methodical that his crimes defied conventional understanding of how serial murders typically unfold. The killing spree began on April 8, 1992, at a Payless shoe store in Indianapolis, Indiana. Robin Fuldauer, a 26-year-old mother working her shift as assistant manager, was found shot execution style in the store's back room. The killer had apparently entered the store during normal business hours, forced Robin to the rear of the building, and shot her once in the head with a .22 caliber weapon. No money was taken from the register, no merchandise was stolen, and there were no signs of sexual assault. The murder appeared to be motiveless, carried out with clinical precision by someone who left virtually no physical evidence behind. What made Robin's murder particularly disturbing to investigators was its apparent randomness. She had no known enemies, no involvement in criminal activity, and no personal circumstances that would have made her a target for violence. The store was located in a busy shopping center where the killer would have risked being seen by numerous witnesses. Yet, he had apparently walked in during daylight hours, committed murder, and walked out without arousing suspicion from other shoppers or neighboring businesses. The second attack occurred 3 days later, on April 11th, in Wichita, Kansas, nearly 500 miles from the Indianapolis crime scene. Patricia Magers, 32, and Patricia Smith, 23, were both employees at a Payless shoe store when the killer struck again using an identical method. Both women were found shot in the head with a .22 caliber weapon in the store's back room. Once again, no money was taken, no merchandise was stolen, and the murders appeared to serve no rational purpose beyond the killer's apparent compulsion to execute innocent people in broad daylight. The pattern that was emerging terrified law enforcement officials across the Midwest. Someone was systematically targeting retail workers, specifically brunette women working in shoe stores, and killing them with the same weapon using the same method. The killer's ability to enter busy retail establishments during operating hours, commit murder, and escape without detection suggested either exceptional luck or a thorough understanding of how to avoid surveillance and witnesses. Frank Turner, who was assigned to coordinate the multi-state investigation, recognized that they were dealing with an unprecedented type of serial killer. Unlike most serial murderers who operated in familiar territory with cooling-off periods between attacks, this killer was covering vast distances and striking with shocking frequency. The geographical scope of the crimes suggested someone who was either traveling for business or had no fixed residence, making traditional investigative approaches extremely difficult. The third attack came on April 27, 1992, in Terre Haute, Indiana. Sarah Blessing, 37, was working alone at a Payless shoe store when the killer entered and forced her to the back room. She was found shot once in the head with the same .22 caliber weapon used in the previous murders. Witnesses in nearby stores reported seeing a man of average height and build leaving the shoe store around the time of the murder, but their descriptions were too general to be useful for identification purposes. What made Sarah's murder particularly chilling was the timeline. The killer had struck in Wichita on April 11th, then waited over 2 weeks before attacking again in Terre Haute. This suggested a level of self-control and planning that contradicted the apparent randomness of the victim selection. The killer wasn't acting out of uncontrolled rage or immediate opportunity. He was methodically planning each attack while maintaining the discipline to avoid detection between crimes. The investigation revealed disturbing details about the killer's selection criteria. All 3 victims had been brunette women working alone in Payless shoe stores during daytime hours. The stores were all located in busy shopping centers where the killer could blend in with normal customer traffic. Each murder had been committed in the back room of the store, away from windows where the crime might be witnessed from outside. Frank Turner began developing a profile of someone who was conducting reconnaissance before each attack. The killer had to know the store's layouts, the victims' work schedules, and the peak customer traffic times to execute such precise crimes without being caught. This suggested either someone with retail experience or someone who was investing significant time in surveillance before each murder. The 4th attack occurred on May 3, 1992, in St. Charles, Missouri, just outside St. Louis. Nancy Kitzmiller, 24, was found shot in the head in the back room of yet another Payless shoe store. The Missouri crime scene yielded the same evidence as the previous murders. A single .22 caliber bullet, no robbery, no sexual assault, and no useful physical evidence left behind by the killer. The St. Charles murder confirmed Frank's worst fears about the geographical scope of the investigation. The killer was now operating across a region spanning over 400 miles, from Kansas to Indiana to Missouri. Traditional police coordination methods were proving inadequate for tracking someone who could strike anywhere within such a vast area, and then disappear completely between attacks. The investigation took on new urgency when behavioral analysts from the FBI provided a chilling assessment of the killer's psychology. The precision of the murders, combined with the apparent pleasure the killer derived from targeting specific victim types, suggested someone who was likely to continue killing until stopped by law enforcement or death. The cooling-off periods between attacks might be shortening as the killer gained confidence and refined his methods. On May 7, 1992, the killer struck again in Raytown, Missouri, less than 20 miles from Kansas City. Julie Wrights, 25, became the fifth victim when she was found shot in the head at her Payless shoe store. The proximity of this murder to Frank's jurisdiction meant that the Kansas City Police Department would take the lead role in coordinating the multi-state investigation. The Raytown crime scene provided the most detailed evidence yet recovered. Security cameras from neighboring businesses captured images of a man leaving the shopping center around the time of Julie's murder. The footage showed a white male of average height and build, wearing casual clothing that wouldn't stand out in a retail environment. However, the image quality wasn't sufficient for facial recognition or positive identification. The final confirmed attack in the series occurred on May 27, 1992, in Bloomington, Indiana. Victoria Scheller, 37, was found shot in the head at a Payless shoe store in another busy shopping center. The 3-week gap between the Raytown and Bloomington murders suggested that the killer might be following a specific schedule or route that investigators couldn't predict. Frank Turner's investigation ultimately compiled evidence linking at least 6 murders across 5 states to the same .22 caliber weapon. Ballistics testing confirmed that all the victims had been killed with bullets fired from the same gun, establishing definitively that a single killer was responsible for the entire spree. However, despite extensive investigation involving multiple police departments, the FBI, and various state law enforcement agencies, no suspect was ever identified or arrested. The I-70 killer case, named for the interstate highway that connected several of the crime scenes, became one of the most frustrating unsolved cases in Frank's career. The killer's ability to operate across such a wide geographical area while maintaining perfect operational security suggested either exceptional criminal sophistication or extraordinary luck. The abrupt end to the killing spree in May 1992 raised questions about whether the killer had died, been imprisoned for other crimes, or simply moved to a different region where his crimes weren't being connected to the I-70 series. The case remained active for years, with investigators following hundreds of leads and interviewing thousands of potential witnesses. Frank Turner retired from the Kansas City Police Department in 2010, but he never stopped thinking about the 6 women who had been murdered by someone who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost, leaving behind only ballistic evidence and the traumatized families of his victims. The I-70 killer case stands as a testament to how a methodical, mobile serial killer can exploit the jurisdictional boundaries and communication limitations that sometimes hamper multi-state investigations. For Frank Turner and the other investigators who worked the case, it represented not just an unsolved mystery, but a haunting reminder that some criminals possess the intelligence and discipline to commit perfect crimes, leaving law enforcement with evidence of their actions but no path to justice. Let's move to our 9th story. Bruce Jordan had always prided himself on being a cautious driver, the kind of person who maintained safe following distances, used turn signals religiously, and never let road rage get the better of him, despite spending hours each day navigating the increasingly congested streets of suburban Atlanta. At 35, he worked as an insurance adjuster, which meant he'd seen firsthand the devastating consequences of aggressive driving and traffic accidents. This professional awareness made him particularly careful when driving with his family, especially his 6-year-old daughter Emma, who rode in the back seat during their weekend errands and family outings. On this particular Saturday afternoon in August 2018, Bruce was returning from Emma's soccer practice with his daughter buckled safely in her booster seat, chattering excitedly about the goals she'd almost scored and the ice cream he'd promised her if she kept practicing her footwork. The drive from the sports complex to their neighborhood typically took about 15 minutes through a mix of residential streets and busier arterial roads that connected the various suburbs sprawling north of Atlanta. The incident began, as these situations often do, with something completely minor and forgettable. Bruce was approaching a four-way intersection controlled by stop signs when he noticed a pickup truck approaching from his left at what seemed like an unsafe speed. Rather than risk a collision by proceeding through the intersection at his normal pace, Bruce chose to wait an extra few seconds to ensure the other driver had come to a complete stop before proceeding. This small act of defensive driving apparently enraged the pickup truck's driver, a middle-aged man with shoulder-length hair who began honking his horn aggressively and gesturing angrily through his windshield. Bruce couldn't understand what had triggered such a hostile response to what he considered basic traffic safety. But he chose to ignore the other driver's behavior and continue toward home, hoping the situation would de-escalate naturally. Unfortunately, the pickup truck driver had no intention of letting the perceived slight go unanswered. As Bruce proceeded through the intersection and continued down the residential street, he noticed in his rearview mirror that the pickup was following him, maintaining an uncomfortably close following distance, while the driver continued to gesture and apparently shout inside his vehicle. Bruce's first instinct was to take a circuitous route home to avoid leading an angry stranger to his family's residence. He made several unnecessary turns through the subdivision, hoping the other driver would lose interest and go about his business. Emma, who had been chattering happily about her soccer practice just moments earlier, began to notice her father's tense behavior and the aggressive driving of the vehicle behind them. "Daddy, why is that man following us?" Emma asked from the back seat, her voice carrying the worry that children develop when they sense their parents are stressed or frightened. Bruce tried to maintain a calm demeanor for his daughter's sake while internally debating his options. He could drive to the nearest police station, but that would mean prolonging Emma's exposure to this volatile situation. He could pull over in a public place and hope the other driver would simply pass by. But there was no guarantee that would end the confrontation. Most concerning of all was the possibility that this was just the beginning of an escalating situation that could put Emma in real danger. The pickup truck driver's behavior became increasingly erratic as the pursuit continued. He began tailgating Bruce's vehicle so closely that collision seemed inevitable if Bruce had to brake suddenly. The man was clearly visible in Bruce's mirrors, gesticulating wildly and apparently screaming, though the closed windows prevented any actual communication about what had triggered his rage. After several minutes of this terrifying pursuit through residential streets, Bruce made the decision to drive to a nearby shopping center where he hoped the presence of other people might discourage the aggressive driver from escalating the situation further. The shopping center was busy with weekend traffic, and Bruce thought that witnesses might either deter violence or be able to call for help if the situation deteriorated. Bruce pulled into the shopping center parking lot and chose a space near the main entrance where there would be maximum visibility from other shoppers and store employees. He hoped this would be the end of the confrontation, that the pickup driver would realize how ridiculous his behavior had been and simply drive away. Instead, what happened next would traumatize Emma for years to come and fundamentally change Bruce's understanding of how quickly everyday situations could turn deadly. The pickup truck pulled into the parking space directly next to Bruce's vehicle, and the driver immediately exited his truck and began walking toward Bruce's car. What Bruce saw next defied belief and instantly transformed what had been a traffic disagreement into a life-threatening emergency. The man was carrying what appeared to be a full-sized fire axe, holding it in both hands as he approached Bruce's vehicle with obvious hostile intent. Bruce's mind raced as he tried to process the surreal nature of what was happening. Someone had apparently been driving around suburban Atlanta with an axe in their vehicle, ready to use it as a weapon in response to minor traffic disagreements. The premeditated nature of carrying such a weapon suggested this wasn't the man's first violent confrontation, and Bruce realized with growing horror that he and Emma had stumbled into an encounter with someone who was genuinely dangerous and potentially unstable. "Daddy, what is that man doing?" Emma asked from the back seat, her voice now tight with fear as she saw the approaching figure with the axe. Bruce's paternal instincts kicked in with overwhelming force. Whatever happened next, he had to protect his daughter from both physical harm and psychological trauma. He quickly assessed his options while the axe-wielding man continued his approach. Bruce could try to drive away, but the man was now close enough to the vehicle that sudden movement might provoke an immediate attack. He could get out and try to reason with the man, but that would leave Emma alone in the car and expose Bruce to potential injury or death. The man with the axe reached Bruce's vehicle and began attempting to open the driver's side door while shouting threats and profanities that Bruce couldn't fully understand through the closed windows. When he found the door locked, the man raised the axe as if preparing to smash the window, which would have sent glass fragments flying toward Emma in the back seat. In that moment of absolute terror, Bruce made a split-second decision that probably saved both their lives. He threw the car into reverse and backed out of the parking space as quickly as possible, forcing the axe-wielding man to jump backward to avoid being hit by the moving vehicle. Bruce then shifted into drive and accelerated toward the parking lot exit, leaving the dangerous stranger standing among the parked cars with his weapon. As they fled the shopping center, Bruce could see in his rearview mirror that the man was returning to his pickup truck, apparently intending to continue the pursuit. Bruce drove directly to the nearest police station, calling 911 on his cell phone as he drove to report the incident and request immediate assistance. The police response was swift and professional. Officers took detailed statements from both Bruce and Emma, though they were careful to minimize the 6-year-old's exposure to the more disturbing aspects of the incident. The shopping center's security cameras had captured portions of the confrontation, providing video evidence of the man's threatening behavior with the axe. However, despite having clear video footage and multiple witness accounts, the axe-wielding attacker was never located or arrested. The pickup truck's license plate had been partially obscured by mud or deliberate tampering, making vehicle identification impossible. The man's appearance was generic enough that he couldn't be positively identified from security footage or witness descriptions. The incident left lasting psychological scars on both Bruce and Emma. Emma, who had been dealing with cancer treatment earlier in her young life, later told counselors that the road rage incident was more terrifying than any of her medical procedures had been. The random, senseless nature of the violence was something her 6-year-old mind struggled to comprehend, leading to months of nightmares and anxiety about car rides. Bruce found himself constantly looking over his shoulder during daily driving, wondering if the next minor traffic interaction might escalate into another life-threatening situation. He installed a dash cam in his vehicle and began carrying pepper spray. Though he recognized that these precautions offered little protection against someone carrying an axe and willing to use it. The case became part of a growing file of road rage incidents that Atlanta area police were tracking with increasing concern. The anonymity provided by vehicles, combined with the stress of urban traffic and the easy availability of weapons, was creating a perfect storm for violent confrontations between strangers. Bruce's experience was unusual only in the weapon involved. Police reported numerous incidents of drivers threatening each other with firearms, knives, and improvised weapons over minor traffic disagreements. For Emma, now a teenager, the memory of that terrifying afternoon serves as a permanent reminder of how quickly normal life can turn dangerous. She's spoken publicly about the incident as part of anti-bullying and violence prevention programs, describing how the experience taught her that some people carry anger and violence with them wherever they go, waiting for an excuse to unleash it on innocent victims. Bruce never learned what had motivated such an extreme response to a routine traffic interaction. Perhaps the man had been having personal problems that had nothing to do with Bruce's careful driving. Perhaps he had a history of mental illness or substance abuse that made him prone to violent outbursts. Or perhaps he was simply someone who had never learned to control his temper and had access to deadly weapons. Whatever the underlying cause, the incident remains a chilling example of how road rage can escalate beyond verbal confrontation or reckless driving into genuine terrorism. For Bruce and Emma, a routine drive home from soccer practice became a brush with deadly violence that changed their perspective on personal safety and the potential for evil to appear in the most mundane circumstances. The axe that stranger carried that day wasn't just a tool or weapon. It was a symbol of the rage and potential for violence that can lurk beneath the surface of everyday interactions, waiting for the smallest trigger to explode into life-threatening confrontation. For a 6-year-old girl who had already fought cancer, it represented a different kind of battle entirely, one against the unpredictable darkness that can emerge from the hearts of strangers sharing the same roads and spaces we all navigate in our daily lives. Let's move to our 10th story. Detective Diana had worked missing persons cases for the California Highway Patrol for over 12 years, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the statistical anomaly that would define the most disturbing case of her career. It began in March 2020, when her supervisor handed her a thick file containing data that had been compiled by the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, along with a request to investigate what appeared to be an impossible pattern of disappearances along one of America's most scenic highways. The Pacific Coast Highway, officially designated as State Route 1, stretches for 655 miles along California's coastline from Dana Point in Orange County to Leggett in Mendocino County. Renowned for its breathtaking ocean views, dramatic cliffs, and access to some of the most beautiful beaches in the world, Highway 1 attracts millions of visitors annually, making it one of the most heavily traveled scenic routes in the United States. Tourism officials promoted it as the ultimate road trip destination, a ribbon of asphalt that connected charming coastal communities while providing unparalleled access to California's natural beauty. What the tourism brochures didn't mention, and what Diana discovered in those first few pages of the file, was that the Pacific Coast Highway also held a more sinister distinction. According to federal data compiled over the previous 15 years, more people went missing along Highway 1 than any other single road in America. The numbers were staggering and defied any reasonable explanation based on traffic volume, accident rates, or typical missing person statistics. Between 2005 and 2020, a total of 142 individuals had disappeared while traveling along various segments of the Pacific Coast Highway. These weren't cases of people getting lost hiking in adjacent wilderness areas or drowning at nearby beaches. These were individuals who had been documented as traveling on or near Highway 1 and who had subsequently vanished without leaving any trace of their whereabouts, their vehicles, or their ultimate fate. Diana's initial reaction was skepticism. Missing person statistics could be misleading when they didn't account for variables like population density, tourism volume, or the tendency for people to engage in risky behaviors while on vacation. However, as she delved deeper into the data, patterns emerged that couldn't be explained by conventional factors. and that suggested something far more disturbing was occurring along California's most beautiful highway. The demographic profile of the missing individuals was remarkably consistent and deeply troubling. Of the 142 documented disappearances, 127 involved males between the ages of 28 and 35. This represented nearly 90% of all cases, a statistical concentration that was virtually impossible to explain through random chance or typical missing person patterns. The remaining 15 cases involved women and older men, but even these outliers fell within a broader age range of 25 to 40 years old. Diana spent weeks analyzing the individual case files, looking for connections beyond the basic demographic similarities. What she found was even more disturbing than the age and gender patterns. The vast majority of the missing individuals had been traveling alone, often on road trips or vacation drives along the scenic highway. Many had been documented at gas stations, restaurants, or tourist attractions along Highway 1 just hours or days before their disappearances were reported. The geographic distribution of the disappearances was particularly unsettling, rather than being concentrated in remote or dangerous areas of the highway. The vanishings appeared to occur with equal frequency along the entire length of the route. Cases had been reported from the urbanized areas near Los Angeles, all the way to the isolated stretches near Big Sur and beyond. This suggested that whatever was causing these disappearances wasn't limited to any particular location or set of circumstances. Diana began creating detailed timeline reconstructions for each case, trying to identify the last known locations and activities of the missing individuals. A disturbing pattern emerged from this analysis. Many of the missing persons had made their final confirmed contacts, phone calls, text messages, or social media posts from specific areas along Highway 1 that recurred repeatedly in the case files. One particularly troubling cluster of disappearances centered around the area near Hearst Castle, the famous tourist attraction built by newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. 7 different individuals had vanished after visiting or expressing intentions to visit the castle between 2008 and 2018. Their vehicles were found abandoned in parking areas along Highway 1, often with personal belongings still inside. But the travelers themselves had simply disappeared. Another concentration of cases occurred near the Big Sur region, where the highway winds through some of the most remote and dramatically beautiful coastline in California. 11 people had gone missing in this area over the 15-year period, including a group of 3 friends whose abandoned campsite was found intact, complete with food still cooking over a camp stove when park rangers discovered it 3 days after the men's planned return date. Diana's investigation revealed that many of the missing individuals had been experienced travelers or outdoor enthusiasts who would have been unlikely to fall victim to accidents or get lost under normal circumstances. Several were military veterans with survival training. Others were professional drivers or tour guides who knew the highway intimately. The idea that so many competent, capable adults could simply vanish without explanation challenged every assumption Diana had about missing person cases. The vehicle evidence was particularly puzzling. In cases where the missing persons' cars were recovered, they were typically found in pristine condition with no signs of struggle, mechanical failure, or accident damage. Personal belongings were usually undisturbed, including wallets, phones, and valuables that would normally be targets for robbery. The cars were often found in locations that made no logical sense. Abandoned in remote parking areas miles from where the individuals had last been seen, or left in tourist areas during times when the missing persons had no documented reason to be there. Diana began interviewing family members and friends of the missing individuals, hoping to identify common factors or shared experiences that might explain the disappearances. What she discovered was a series of troubling accounts that seemed to defy rational explanation. Multiple families reported receiving phone calls from their missing relatives in the days following their disappearances. Calls that came from the missing person's own cell phones but featured only static, breathing sounds, or voices that family members couldn't positively identify as their loved ones. Even more disturbing were reports from several families about strange encounters with people claiming to be their missing relatives. In 3 separate cases, individuals matching the physical descriptions of missing persons had appeared at their families' homes weeks or months after their disappearances, but had behaved in ways that convinced family members these were not actually their missing loved ones. These imposters seemed to have detailed knowledge about the missing person's lives and relationships, but displayed personality changes so dramatic that families refused to accept them as genuine. Diana's investigation expanded to include interviews with Highway 1 business owners, park rangers, and local law enforcement officials along the entire route. What emerged from these conversations was a picture of a highway community that had become accustomed to unexplained disappearances and had developed unofficial protocols for dealing with them. Gas station attendants reported frequent visits from people looking for missing family members. Hotel and restaurant workers described encounters with guests who seemed disoriented or claimed to be traveling to destinations that didn't exist. Several business owners along the highway reported incidents involving customers who appeared normal initially but exhibited increasingly strange behavior during their visits. These individuals would ask unusual questions about local geography, make references to places or events that didn't correspond to reality, or display knowledge about the area that seemed impossible given their claimed origins. In multiple cases, these strange customers had paid for goods or services with currency that appeared authentic, but bore serial numbers or design elements that didn't match any known U.S. currency. The most chilling accounts came from park rangers and emergency responders who had been involved in search and rescue operations for missing Highway 1 travelers. Several described finding evidence of campsites or temporary shelters in remote areas that appeared to have been occupied recently, but contained no trace of their inhabitants. These sites often featured personal belongings that matched descriptions of items belonging to missing persons. But the belongings were arranged in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than abandonment during an emergency. Diana's research revealed that the disappearance pattern along Highway 1 wasn't entirely modern. Historical records from the early 20th century documented similar unexplained vanishings along the coastal route, even before the modern highway existed. Spanish colonial records from the 18th and 19th centuries contained accounts of travelers who disappeared while following coastal trails that roughly paralleled the current highway route. Native American oral histories from the region included stories about areas along the coast where people would vanish inexplicably, never to be seen again. The investigation reached a turning point when Diana began analyzing cell phone data from the missing persons. Working with telecommunications companies and federal agencies, she was able to track the final known locations of many missing individuals based on their phones' connections to cell towers along Highway 1. What she discovered was a pattern that defied technological explanation. In numerous cases, the missing persons' phones had continued to register location data for days or weeks after their disappearances. But the locations were impossible. Phones were showing connections to cell towers in areas where no towers existed, or were registering positions that would have required the phones to be hundreds of feet underground or suspended in midair over the ocean. Some phones appeared to be moving at speeds that would have been impossible for ground-based travel, suggesting either equipment malfunctions or movement patterns that violated known physics. Diana's final report to her supervisors documented a mystery that challenged conventional understanding of missing person cases and suggested the possibility of factors beyond normal criminal or accidental explanations. The concentration of disappearances along Highway 1, the consistent demographic patterns, the impossibility of so many competent adults vanishing without trace, and the technological anomalies all pointed to something unprecedented in law enforcement experience. The case remains officially open, with Diana continuing to investigate new disappearances that occur along Highway 1 with depressing regularity. Each new case adds to the statistical impossibility of the pattern, while providing no additional answers about what might be causing these vanishings. For Diana, the Pacific Coast Highway has transformed from California's most beautiful drive into America's most dangerous mystery, a place where the boundary between the explainable and the impossible seems to blur like fog rolling in from the Pacific Ocean. The 142 documented disappearances represent more than just statistics. They represent families destroyed, lives interrupted, and questions that may never be answered. For Diana, each case file contains not just data, but the story of someone who set out to experience the beauty of California's coast, and instead encountered something that removed them from the world entirely, leaving behind only the echo of their absence and the growing certainty that Highway 1 holds secrets that may be too disturbing for rational minds to fully comprehend. Let's move to our 11th story. Tyler and Bobby had been best friends since college, bonding over their shared love of adventure and their willingness to take risks that their more cautious classmates avoided. At 29, both men worked demanding jobs in Seattle's tech industry, which made their monthly weekend escapes into the Pacific Northwest wilderness feel like necessary therapy for their overstressed minds. They'd hiked most of the major trails within driving distance of the city, camped in designated areas throughout Washington and Oregon, and considered themselves experienced outdoor enthusiasts who could handle whatever nature might throw at them. On this particular Friday evening in October 2021, Tyler picked up Bobby in his modified Jeep Wrangler, a vehicle he'd specifically equipped for off-road adventures with reinforced bumpers, all-terrain tires, and recovery equipment that had gotten them out of difficult situations during previous expeditions. Their plan was simple: drive east toward the Cascade Mountains, find some interesting back roads to explore, and spend the weekend camping in areas that weren't crowded with tourists or casual hikers. Bobby had researched several promising locations using satellite imagery and topographic maps, identifying Forest Service roads that appeared to lead to remote valleys where they could set up camp away from established campgrounds. Both men were experienced with primitive camping and carried everything they needed for a comfortable weekend in the wilderness, including plenty of food, water purification equipment, and emergency communication devices. The drive began normally, with Tyler navigating the familiar highways leading away from Seattle while Bobby served as navigator, consulting GPS coordinates and paper maps to guide them toward their chosen destination. They'd made similar trips dozens of times before, always returning on Sunday evening with stories of beautiful landscapes, challenging hiking trails, and the kind of peaceful solitude that was impossible to find in their urban daily lives. It was approaching sunset when they turned off the main highway onto a Forest Service road that Bobby had identified on his maps. The road was unpaved but well-maintained, winding through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock that blocked most of the fading daylight. Tyler engaged the Jeep's four-wheel drive system as the road became steeper and more challenging. But nothing about the terrain seemed unusual or particularly difficult for an experienced off-road driver. About 12 miles from the highway, they encountered their first sign that something might be wrong. Tyler's GPS unit, which had been providing reliable navigation throughout the trip, suddenly lost satellite signal despite the clear sky visible through breaks in the forest canopy. Bobby checked his phone and discovered that he had no cellular service, which wasn't unusual in remote mountain areas, but was disappointing since they'd hoped to share some photos of their adventure on social media. The road continued to climb steadily through the forest, occasionally offering glimpses of distant peaks through the trees, but otherwise maintaining the same character of dense woodland on both sides. Tyler estimated they'd traveled about 18 miles from the highway when they crested a small ridge and found themselves looking down into a valley that didn't match anything they'd seen on their maps or satellite images. The valley was completely filled with fog, creating an almost perfect bowl of white mist that obscured everything below the ridgeline where they'd stopped. What was strange about the fog was its uniformity and density. It looked more like a solid white surface than a normal weather phenomenon. Neither Tyler nor Bobby had ever seen fog that appeared so artificial, as if someone had filled the valley with cotton batting rather than natural moisture condensation. Tyler pulled the Jeep to a stop at a small turnout overlooking the fog-filled valley, and both men got out to assess the situation. The silence was absolute. No bird songs, no insect sounds, no wind moving through the trees. Even their own voices seemed muffled and distant when they spoke to each other. Bobby consulted his topographic maps, but the valley below didn't correspond to any geographical features shown on the charts. "This doesn't make sense," Bobby said, spreading the map across the Jeep's hood. "According to this, we should be looking at a gradual slope down to a creek bed, not a valley filled with fog. And look at this. There's no valley this size anywhere in this area." Tyler studied the maps while glancing repeatedly at the impossible scene below them. The fog wasn't moving or shifting the way normal fog should. It maintained perfect boundaries, as if it were contained by invisible walls. Most disturbing of all was the way their headlights seemed to be absorbed by the white mist rather than reflecting back as they should have. Against their better judgment, but driven by curiosity and the confidence that came from years of successful wilderness adventures, Tyler and Bobby decided to descend into the valley to investigate. Tyler shifted the Jeep into its lowest gear range and began the careful descent down a road that seemed to lead directly into the fog bank. As they entered the mist, the world around them changed in ways that defied explanation. The fog was thicker than anything either man had ever experienced, reducing visibility to less than 3 feet in any direction. Tyler was forced to stop the Jeep repeatedly to avoid driving off what might have been cliffs or into obstacles they couldn't see until they were almost touching them. More disturbing than the limited visibility was the way the fog seemed to muffle all sound. Tyler's diesel engine, normally loud enough to be heard for miles in mountain terrain, became a whisper. Their voices, when they tried to communicate, seemed to be absorbed by the mist before reaching each other's ears, despite sitting just feet apart in the Jeep's cabin. Bobby attempted to use his compass to maintain their sense of direction, but the instrument began spinning wildly, unable to locate magnetic north. His altimeter, which had been functioning perfectly during their climb to the ridge, now displayed readings that fluctuated impossibly, showing them alternately hundreds of feet above and below sea level within seconds. The road beneath them, which had been clearly defined dirt and gravel, became increasingly difficult to follow. Tyler found himself having to guess at the route, following what seemed like the most logical path through the fog, while hoping they weren't becoming hopelessly lost. Several times, he stopped the Jeep when the path ahead seemed to disappear entirely, forcing them to back up and try alternative routes that appeared and vanished in the shifting mist. After what felt like hours of creeping through the fog at walking speed, Tyler and Bobby realized they had lost all sense of direction, time, and location. Tyler's watch had stopped working, showing the same time it had displayed when they first entered the fog. Bobby's digital devices were malfunctioning, displaying impossible readings or simply showing blank screens. Most terrifying of all was the growing realization that they couldn't find their way back to the ridge where they had entered the valley. Every attempt to retrace their route led them deeper into the fog. as if the landscape itself was shifting around them. The road they had followed down into the valley seemed to have vanished, replaced by paths that led in directions that made no geographical sense. Tyler made the decision to stop the Jeep and wait for the fog to clear naturally, assuming it was a temporary weather phenomenon that would dissipate with changing atmospheric conditions. However, as hours passed with no change in the fog's density or their situation, both men began to experience a panic that went beyond simple concern about being lost. The fog seemed to be affecting their ability to think clearly. Bobby found himself forgetting basic information, his phone number, his address, even his last name at times. Tyler experienced similar cognitive disruption, losing track of conversations mid-sentence and finding himself unable to remember why they had decided to explore this area in the first place. Even more disturbing were the sounds that began to emerge from the fog around them. Voices that seemed to be calling their names, but from impossible directions and distances. Footsteps that circled their stationary vehicle without ever revealing the people making them. The sound of other vehicles passing nearby, complete with engine noise and tire sounds, but no visible lights or actual presence they could detect. Bobby opened the Jeep's door to investigate one of these phantom sounds and found that the fog immediately began pouring into the vehicle's interior like a living thing. The mist seemed to have substance and intent, flowing around his legs and creating sensations of pressure and movement that felt distinctly unnatural. Tyler had to physically pull Bobby back into the Jeep and close the door to stop the fog from filling their only remaining space of relative safety. The psychological pressure of their situation intensified as both men realized they were completely cut off from the outside world. Their emergency communication devices weren't functioning. Their GPS units showed no satellite connection. And their attempts to drive out of the fog only led them deeper into terrain that shouldn't have existed according to any maps or their previous knowledge of the area. Tyler made a desperate decision to abandon the established path entirely and attempt to climb straight up what he hoped was the side of the valley, using the Jeep's four-wheel drive capabilities to scale terrain that would normally be considered impassable. However, every direction they traveled seemed to be downhill, as if the valley was subtly shifting its geography to prevent their escape. The breakthrough came when Bobby, in a moment of clarity that cut through the fog's apparent effect on their thinking, remembered a survival technique they'd learned during wilderness training. He began making noise, shouting, banging on the Jeep's exterior, honking the horn in regular patterns, not to attract rescue, but to create acoustic landmarks that might help them navigate by sound reflection. This technique revealed something impossible about their environment. The sounds Bobby created were reflecting off surfaces in directions that defied the topography they could see. Echoes were coming from above them when they should have been bouncing off valley walls, and from below them when they were supposedly at the valley's bottom. The acoustic evidence suggested they were in a space that didn't conform to normal three-dimensional geometry. Tyler used this acoustic information to guide their escape attempt, driving toward areas where the sound reflections suggested open space rather than relying on visual cues that the fog made unreliable. This approach led them up an impossibly steep incline that felt more like driving up a wall than climbing a normal slope, but eventually brought them to a ridge where the fog suddenly ended as abruptly as it had begun. They emerged from the fog bank to find themselves on a completely different ridge than the one where they had entered the valley, in an area that wasn't shown on any of their maps. Tyler's GPS unit immediately regained satellite connection and showed their location as being 12 miles east of where they had been when they entered the fog. A distance that would have been impossible to travel given the amount of fuel they had used and the terrain they had covered. Both men's watches had resumed normal operation, but showed a time that indicated they had been in the fog for over 18 hours. despite their subjective experience feeling like only 3 or 4 hours had passed. Bobby's equipment readings showed they had somehow gained nearly 2,000 feet in elevation while feeling like they had been traveling downhill the entire time. The drive back to Seattle passed in stunned silence as Tyler and Bobby tried to process what they had experienced. Neither man could adequately explain what had happened in that fog-filled valley, and their attempts to locate it again using GPS coordinates and satellite imagery proved futile. The valley didn't appear to exist on any maps or aerial photographs they could find. The experience fundamentally changed both men's approach to wilderness exploration and their understanding of reality itself. They continued their friendship, but never again ventured into unmarked forest areas or attempted to explore locations that weren't thoroughly documented on official maps. The memory of being trapped in a place that seemed to exist outside normal space and time served as a permanent reminder that some mysteries are too dangerous to investigate. Before we conclude this terrifying journey through 11 disturbing true road trip horror stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because stories like these remind us that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. Drop a comment below sharing your own experiences with unexplained phenomena or close calls during road trips. But remember that some stories are better left unexplored in person. Here's some crucial advice to keep you safe on your own road trips. Always inform someone of your exact route and expected arrival time before traveling to remote areas. Carry multiple forms of emergency communication, including satellite communicators that work where cell phones fail. Never investigate unusual phenomena alone, and trust your instincts when something feels wrong. That internal alarm system has evolved to keep you alive. Most importantly, remember that curiosity can be deadly when it leads you away from marked trails and established roads. The wilderness holds mysteries that some minds aren't meant to solve, and the price of that knowledge might be higher than you're willing to pay. Stay safe out there, and remember that sometimes the best adventure is the one that brings you home, alive, to tell about it.